Of the second day of the 5th annual STM conference. And we bring to you our final roundtable, and that is the International Roundtable, moderated by Therese Jones. Therese joined the Satellite Industry Association as its Senior Director of Policy a mere year and 2 months ago. It's unbelievable. It feels like you've been there forever. And prior to that, she was doing a lot of policy at RAND. I met her when she was just about to embark on an internship at UN USA. And I think Moriba and Therese and I went and sang karaoke together, if I'm not mistaken. So maybe if you're lucky, she'll get up and sing. So she is going to be at the helm of today's final and I am so pleased to say most diverse international panel that this conference has ever had, because we actually have a few continents that are represented, and I'm just thrilled. And we even have a U.S. person up there on the international panel, which means it's really not U.S.-centric at all. We're including ourselves as part of the international discourse. So with no further ado, Therese, I hand it off to you.
Thanks so much, Diane. So first up, we have Dan Oltrogge, who is the Director of AGI's Center for Space Standards and Innovation, Program Manager of the Space Data Center, Space Policy and Analyst Expert for AGI's Commercial Space Operations Center, who is a frequent author of technical papers and developer of numerous space operations and debris mitigation international standards and best practices, which he will be talking about today. His technical focus areas include astrodynamics, launch and orbital operations, collision avoidance, space debris, RF interference mitigation, SSA, and STM. So, Dan, feel free to take over.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here. This is my first time at this venue, and I'm finding it very rewarding. So, thank you for letting me join in here. I want to talk to you about the international flavor of space traffic management as I've been involved in it. As Therese mentioned, I'm in a Center for Space Standards and Innovation, so hopefully we do some space standards work. And that is all at the international level, or at least the preponderance of. I did put a picture of the first 3 revs of the post-Iridium Cosmos collision, which shows you in a color scale the probability that a fragment goes to a certain point in space. I put that up there because I wanted to emphasize collisions and STM are international. They have to be. These are 2 international objects come together. Let's see, grab the clicker. Okay, so what's the definition of space traffic management? I've done a bunch of papers which includes text on that, and I'm kind of tired of it. But I will highlight a few things. There is not agreement still on space traffic management. And I'm not clear that there ever will be, just because of the various bifurcations of it in various areas. But there are a lot of countries and companies and organizations that view space traffic management in a bigger context, bigger scope than what the U.S. Space Policy Directive does, to include space weather and RFI events, Earth orientation parameters, near-Earth object asteroids, and comets. So that's worth keeping in mind. But even if you take the most narrow definition of that, which focuses on safety of flight, which is what the Space Policy Directive 3 has, I would very strongly argue nobody's really doing space traffic management today. There isn't anyone directing someone to go this way or that way. And if you look at the percentages, which Ed so rightly brought up in LEO, there is very unlikely that you will need to do a true management, because only one object, if even that, can maneuver. In GEO, that is a different statistic. There's a lot more active satellites. You're much more likely, even with the slots assigned, you're much more likely to have to coordinate at a minimum. So just to quote one operator as they put it, he's not aware of any collision risk where 2 active satellites and operators haven't worked together to address it. It just hasn't been a problem. Now, the Space Data Association that TS mentioned earlier, that's something that we've been working with and for the last 10 years. And to my knowledge, it's the only actual space traffic coordination facility out there. We pull in all the data from the operators and generate warnings and alerts, and they act accordingly. Now, I'm in a college campus, so I thought, well, gosh, what's better than a test? So if you put your mind into the test, when you're first into kindergarten, you circle things, and first grade and second grade, you draw lines from one column to another, and eventually you get into the multiple guess column. And the last ESPI venue a couple weeks ago, Moriba was one of the keynotes at. Inevitably, the question comes up after the presentations. Well, gosh, what's the answer for space traffic management? And I just want to scream at that point. There isn't one answer. I've listed all these things here. And you know the type of multiple guess test where at the very end they come on and say, all of the above, and you say, oh yeah, that's the one. Well, we can't look at this in terms of a single sensor or a single company or a single website or a single algorithm. This has to be looked in its entirety, and all these things are relevant. Now, this is some data. I threw this in there. I'm not going to go through it in detail, but I just want you to be aware of it. This week at the International Space Symposium for Flight Dynamics, this paper, which I co-authored, was presented, and it includes data in LEO and GEO on kind of how well the existing SP data ephemeris is working for safety of flight. And you can see an orange dotted line here. Whoops, right here is an orange dotted vertical line. That's some notion of a threshold. And then as a function of altitude here, you can see the 50th percentile, or this is the median, values for a bunch of different categories of objects and orbits and orbit regimes. So high eccentricity, for example, versus low, and that sort of thing. And you can see pretty clearly from this, we're doing pretty good, typically. But the follow-on message is, if you take it to the 95th percentile, so 1 in 20, we're not. We've blown our threshold. Now, different operators, different countries, they're going to have different thresholds than this orange line. That's fine. You can use whatever threshold you want. But the point to hit home is we're doing pretty well in some things, but not in everything. And so we're not there. And we have a long ways to go to get there. That's why we have to do a holistic approach and try and address this shortcomings. So out of that huge list from the test, I'm going to pick some of the more international flavored things for the purpose of this panel. And they include, to me, crowdsourcing of data. I think that's critical. And figuring out how to fuse at the observational level, not at the ephemeris level. There have been attempts to fuse at the ephemeris level, not so successful. Looking at metadata and sharing maneuvers, your maneuver plans, your physical characteristics for your satellites. This is all relevant to safety of flight. And then look at international standards, which I think are critical for data exchange. Look at the long-term sustainability guidelines. And finally, look at capacity building and competence building. These are all parts of what the international flavoring can do at a minimum. So a bit about international standards. They are probably the driest thing you could work on. They're not exciting compared to launch, which is going to happen shortly. We're going to watch a launch. And then you got standards. But they do provide a reference framework and a common language to facilitate trade and technology transfer. There are many places where we know for space operations and safety of flight, we have to exchange data. This gives us a context for doing that. And also, I want to highlight the third bullet up there. These international standards are not guidelines. There's a distinct difference. A lot of times people conflate the two. They're different. Standards are written in a way that could be contractually incorporated into agreements and mechanisms. So just going into the International Organization for Standardization, ISO, there are two flavors of that, SE13 and SE14. SE13 builds data standards, and we're building the orbit data message. We're revising that. This is the most popular SE13 CCSDS standard out there. This is downloaded more than any other standard because people need to exchange their data. It's critical. But there's a lot of others. Conjunction data message you may be familiar with. That one, I'm co-leading the revision of that, and that's just starting. SE14 is another group, Subcommittee 14 in ISO, and they standardize best practices. And these all get, there's a list there, I'm not going to go through them, but this all gets to what SPD3 is trying to accomplish and what long-term sustainability guidelines are trying to accomplish. How well do the standards by themselves address some of the requirements in long-term sustainability? Here's my assessment. And basically green is good, that these standards contribute to meeting those requirements. So you can see in SE13 and SE14, we've got a lot of greens there. And just to point out, there are places in SPD3 that explicitly calls out for an international standard. And those are these blue dots down here. So yes, it calls for them, and yes, we have some. They already exist. We don't need to start from scratch here. Last slide, I think, is just talking a bit about the space governance framework. This is our perspective on how integrated and interconnected the whole regulatory and space operator community is, and IDC and UN COPIUS. Just to give you an example, the IDC has guidelines. Where did those start? They started by space operator best practice. So those were rolled into IDC. They started with those as a framework and went on from there. So this is all interconnected, and it's not the case where someone can just mandate something and go with it. So that's it. Welcome your questions, and thank you.
So the last three panelists you've all already heard from earlier today, so I'll be brief in their introductions. Next up is Yu Takeuchi, who, as a reminder, is serving for JAXA since 2007, who is currently working as an Associate Senior Administrator at Management and Integration Department of the Human Spaceflight Technology Directorate. He's also working as a researcher at the Institute of Space Law of Keio University. So he's going to be continuing on with his presentation from earlier this morning and talking more about directly what's going on in Japan.
Thank you, Therese. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. It's me again. This time I would like you to join me crossing the Pacific Ocean, and I would like to explain a little bit about the Japanese situation on the STEM discussion. Where is it? Oh, here. So since, it works. Since from 1955, we started our space exploration, and it's been more than 60 years of history until today. But I'm not going to explain all of this history. But the epoch changing was in 2008 that we established the basic space law, and under the basic space law, basic space plan has been also established. And it took around 4 years for reforming the governmental structure in order to direct national space program. And currently, so those three new organizations has been established under the basic space law. Firstly, now we're having strategic headquarters for national space policy, which is chaired by the Prime Minister. And we also have the advisory committee named Committee on National Space Policy, which is an advisory committee to the strategic headquarters, essentially to the Prime Minister. And we're having a secretariat, National Space Policy Secretariat in the Cabinet Office, supporting those two decision-making organizations. So using those instruments, in the very next year, in 2013, we agreed with the US government the SSA sharing agreement, as likewise the other operators and allied countries. And now we're we're also having a major commercial operators who are agreed with the SSA sharing agreement, but we also almost all of the governmental operators are using the SSA sharing data together with the provided by JSPOC or CSPOC, which is changed currently. But regarding the discussion on the STM, all of the things didn't happen until last year. But last year we got several policy change regarding the STM. The first one is that the basic space plan, the government decided to include in the basic space plan to consider future STM policy. It's just for the consideration authorization, which means that there is no authorization for decision yet, but finally the government started to consider the STM policy last year. And they also, well, this is a little bit different, but they also established the license system for space activities, which called Space Activities Act, and it was also enacted last year. And finally, they had one policy report published from the Subcommittee of Space Legislation, which is the subsidiary committee of the Committee on National Space Policy. And this report is dealing with the possibility of governmental compensation measures to third-party damage caused by satellite, which means it on-orbit third-party liability. So this is a kind of a history. And looking into the industries, we don't have, well, this is, in my opinion, this is the Japanese challenges. But currently, we don't have so much industries who are very active in the, especially in the rulemaking process of the, regarding STM. But we're having several industries who contributing to international discussion for, international discussion, which is a commercially centric group for rulemaking on STM. The one is Astroscale, which is a startup company dealing with aiming to have a business for active space debris removal, and they are contributing to CONFOS. The other one is, I'm sorry, the photo is too small, but we also have Astroscale and iSpace, which is also a startup contributing to the World Economic Forum in the discussion of the rulemaking process within the World Economic Forum. Well, looking in this situation, we also started a study group together with the KO and JAXA joint program. This is started last October, and which I served as a coordinator. And we welcome diverse participation. So I cannot tell you the name of the organization because I promised anonymity for their participation. But we're having practitioners, academics, government officials from the diverse, from the space community, essentially. We are employing Chatham House rules. And we don't seek any individual goals, but accept diversity. So this is a group essentially for a group for discussion, discussion for understanding. Well, discussion for discussion. We don't produce nothing. We produce nothing from this group, but we rely on the participants to go back to their own entity to take actions. one of the remarkable characteristic findings from this group, I will show you, I'm not showing you all, but I'll show you one characteristic findings from this group, is that about the conjunction with the congested LEO orbit. We all know that OneWeb is preparing to have a constitution in the altitude of around 1,000 kilometers. I know that they have other plans, but they also have having a constitution. Constitution on 1,000 kilometers. Constellation, sorry. But we're having a company named Axel Space, which launched a program called GIRAS or GROSS. And this is a Earth observation constellation program, satellite program, with the altitude of 600 to 800 kilometers on a dawn-dusk orbit with 40 to 60 satellites. So this orbit is a very congested or cluttered orbit, which is already used by most of the Earth observation satellites. So when we have that GIRAS constellation on the low Earth orbit, together with the OneWeb constellations, when the OneWeb system is going or descending or ascending across the trajectory of GIRAS, we have to have much more frequent orbit control in order to avoid conjunction. So this is one of the findings that the study group looked last year as a possible consideration under the STM issue. Lastly, I will show you the other discussions that we did in the study group. Well, this is the assumption of the orders of discussions that may happening in near future in the international sphere. It's not the order of the priority, but it's the order that the possibility of happening. The first issue will be providing civil STM services, including how to gather data from operators, how to pose incentives on operators to provide their data, or how to allocate their costs for the service provision. The second will be the internationally sharing the SSA data. The most difficult point will be how to clear national security concerns of the other countries, or how to allocate the cost for the database sharing. And last but not least, the discussion should be reached to the common rules for operations. So this is the discussion that we have done so far, but we continue our discussions for understanding, and the actions will follow in the respective entities. Lastly, I wanted to borrow this, that we will continue including that study group to our progress through collaboration. And I believe in the word of Captain DePete last morning. He said that we don't compete on safety, we collaborate. So we would like to continue our collaboration within Japan, but not only within Japan, but internationally. So if you don't claim your copyright, I would like to take this word back to Japan and spread it out around. Thank you.
Okay, next up we have Frank Morlang from the German Aerospace Center, DLR. He has worked on quite a few different areas, from spacecraft reentry and hazard analysis and space traffic integration. And we've heard from him already, but he will be talking today about potential efforts for space traffic integration. Should be, if you close that one, it should be behind it.
Sorry, can you just bring me to my slides?
If you close this PowerPoint, it should be the one up that's up behind it.
Close it here.
Oh, and close Dan's.
Close it there.
Yep, there you go.
Okay, thank you. Slideshow, play from start. Okay, thank you very much. Before lunch, there was a very interesting presentation about risk management, inspiring me to do my own risk management right now, avoiding to kick out my key statement by my own presentation. So please let me start with my key statement. Advanced flexible use of airspace is an integration concept to get rid of civil versus military segregation. So look at the words integration to get rid of segregation in terms of airspace issues. So it sounds that it is worth to have a look at it for space traffic integration issues, and indeed it is. So what is the concept? Please, sorry for the Z here, it's from the German version. Airspace is a continuum for the flexible use of airspace, civil-military integration instead of segregation, and the flexible airspace structures and procedures so that you have time-slotted allocation and usage. Here you can see it how it is, what the plan is, that you have a network manager communicating with the airspace management cells, the national airspace management cells. And on the right side, you have these civil airspace participants, providers, and the military airspace participants. So the connection between all these participants. The same for the flow and capacity management. So regarded as an analog for the former slide. And now what it is advanced flexible use of airspace? It is flexible use of airspace, but plus you have free routing, real-time information sharing. This is the key issue there. So not only collaboration of human beings, collaboration of data. It's very important, and it is needed to have a common situational awareness. So what is the centralized service for? Centralized service for is, what are the centralized services? These centralized services are Eurocontrol services, so it services on or support air traffic management support functions on a central organized European level. There are 18 services, and the service 4 is the support service for advanced flexible use of airspace. So what it covers, advanced flexible use of airspace will cover all the airspace management levels, from long-term planning, so pre-tactical, from strategic, pre-tactical, and execution level, and up until post-execution. So this is how it is organized, these services, and you have a lot of implementation blocks there. The most important are the airspace use plan and the update of the airspace use plan. So the implementation is realized via SWIM, via Network Manager B2P SWIM services. So you can initiate an airspace use plan request and update it. So, very complicated here. What is it? Just an overview how it fits in other services. So the communication with the centralized service 5, which is then the glue, and all these participants there. It looks very complicated, but as you will see, what it is SWIM in this context, SWIM is the fundament for the yellow arrows in this picture. So system-wide information management. And so you can regard it is the glue for all this construction. And here another picture where you can see how it is spread over all these participants. The PanEuropean Network Service, SWIM, is a new installation of that. And so that around all the participants can share the data and can update themselves with the actual status and to get a common situational awareness. Why SWIM? Because on the left you have the current situations, a lot of point-to-point interfaces with proprietary data, so that is not the right way for the future. You have to have a common base and a common structure of information and how the information and the data is shared and communicated. So the SWIM governance, forget all these blocks, forget these different colors, look at the right side. You can see standards, 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 standards. And it shows what SWIM is built on. It's built on standards. So it is a very good example that there was something constructed and avoided the avoidance of reinventing a wheel for self-purposes. So it is built on standards, and you can take it as a motivation not to reinvent the wheel in space traffic management only because of the word space traffic. Just look left, look right, if there is something you can already use. And advanced flexible use of airspace gives a wide range of possibility to be used for space traffic integration. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Frank. Next up, we have Tomas Rosinski, who is a research fellow at the European Space Policy Institute in Vienna. And his presentation this morning covered many of the questions I was going to ask. So he's just going to make some further remarks based on what the panelists have currently said and further discussion of some comments he made this morning.
Yeah, actually, that's correct. I have not prepared a dedicated presentation for this panel. So before we open into the Q&A session, I have a few remarks that I want to convey in here. And again, having this a European hat on my head, I encourage you, if I were to put myself in your position, being a US observer, I have to analyze. Okay, so what Europe is doing in this field or in any other field of space domains, you would probably think that the approach that Europe is taking towards the issues of space traffic management or SSA is maybe probably a bit more conservative to what is actually going on, let's say here in the US. But on this, I would probably say it's not about a different kind of approach. It's that in Europe, we are not at the same level of consideration. So we are not there yet. Maybe there is a recognition of the issue, but by no means there is a recognition of a solution or finding the good policy action towards the problems which are on the table. I mean, in general, when you approach the concept of governance of European space activities, that is something which is difficult to comprehend, to analyze also for us, the Europeans. So usually the threefold structure of national governments, the intergovernmental level, for example, through ESA, or the supranational level through the level of European Union is even more intertwined and even more difficult to analyze when you look at such an issues from the space sector, which has a little bit more of the security flavor. In this, it's still national actors, national governments, who are the key actors in space security in Europe. And then you maybe have ESA, who does a lot in the field of capacity building, and then the European Union, who is consolidating its position in the field of space security, also maybe the other concepts that are related to it, STM, sustainability, and so on. So what I think currently is needed in Europe is just raising the awareness and doing the capacity building. And to do this, I think it's important to be more precise in how we approach the concept. I'm not remember who exactly put this forward in these previous sessions, but to find a solution, you need to fully understand the problem. And I think that the job that we have in Europe in raising the awareness and doing the capacity building, just maybe one example that comes into my mind is the situation in the low Earth orbit. So discussing LEO, I think, in a community which is knowledgeable about the environmental aspect or the traffic situation is appropriate. But if you want to do the raising the awareness and the capacity building, I think it's appropriate to break down this problem a little bit more, be more precise, or as Moriba said maybe yesterday, be more surgical on these issues, to be aware that even if LEO, if it's approached as a single specific protected region, it's not the case throughout the whole LEO. There are specific orbits, specific inclinations, polar areas, which are much more congested, and with the arrival of the large constellations will even more be congested. If we want to do the raising of the awareness, I think the way forward is to break down the problem as much as we can. Another remark that I wanted to put forward, but Moriba was quicker in this in the morning, is to have in mind this cultural aspect and the human factor in this. And if we agree on the fact that the ultimate objective in the field of STM is supposed to be based on an international or even a global approach, there is a big need, so we understand, not just understand what each actor is doing, but how is that actor, he or she, doing it, and why she's doing that. And this is the cultural aspect, and it's the human aspect which comes into play. And the third remark that I have, and it's more of the questions that I want to convey to the audience. I would be happy to listen to whoever has some expertise on this. Specifically in the research that we are doing right now with ESPI, what we quite often hear from European stakeholders is the issue that in the field of SSA there has not yet been developed an appropriate data policy. And a lot of these European stakeholders speak to us about the data policy. So in future of SSA cooperation, being public, private, civil, military, international, so country versus country. I know some of you have experience with this. I know Moriba's team is working on these issues. So what could be for the future the best practices to assure that the data and the information that we exchange is of a high quality, is effective, and at the same time is being say protected against concerns which may be of interrupting the business potential, interrupting some of the national security considerations. So how to make this kind of an effective data policy? I am really putting this out as a question. I do not know the response towards these questions. I would be happy to hear if some of you in the panel or in the audience have more to say on this.
I'd love to hear from the panel on this. What do you think the biggest obstacles are, or the way forward is on data sharing policy internationally?
I'll start. My perspective is strongly influenced by a decade of work with the Space Data Association. They started in 2009, and their first task was to develop a good legal framework to protect the data, to ensure that it's not misused, to ensure also computationally that it's brought into an environment where on a level playing field analyses can be done and the results that go out are agreed upon before the process kicks off. So the operators know, yes, you will share this, you will not share this, at least without our authorization. That's something that I don't see a lot of these various initiatives today looking at, including on the government side a bit. I think perhaps the U.S. government has not considered the proprietary nature of some of the commercial entities. For example, there will be a lot of commercial operators that are willing to share their data, and so we should encourage that. But there will be some that aren't, and they have valid reasons. Sometimes it's other government data. Sometimes it's they feel they have commercial practices that give them a leg up that would be revealed if they shared their data on an ongoing basis. So anyway, that's my answer, is that this needs to be addressed up front, legal framework, computational framework, and get everybody on board first rather than trying to put that in later.
Well, from my experience, I've been in the corpus deliberation of the long-term sustainability issue, including not only the diplomatic committees, but also to the expert meetings, which was held for 4 years. It was run for 5 years. And I should say that the common language worldwide is technology, not the diplomatic words. So what I wanted to say that in expert groups, there was worldwide experts assembled in one room and discussed for the common standard and best practices that what they experienced in these decades. And they concluded in a certain consensus among the experts. Then, when we submitted that results to the diplomacy, it comes to a problem. So my suggestion is coming back to the starting from the bottom-up approach among the operators or the experts who are dealing with the safety of the operation, without relying on the state level. I mean, starting from the bottom-up approach is my suggestion.
So do you think that's the way forward? There's been discussion of creating a Center for International Space Situational Awareness similar to the International GNSS Service, perhaps run by the UN. But from my perspective, at least, there isn't much buy-in from the U.S. government to do that because we already have our own SSA capabilities, and Russia also wants to run this organization, seemingly. So what do you think the most realistic path forward is? Is it bilateral agreements? We have these technical groups, but who's going to be the one to make this happen? Anyone? Yeah.
Personally, I feel it will, in my perspective, be based on the technical capabilities of what your assets or assets of another actor can actually do. I think in this is using the metaphor, the better flashlight you have, the less you can hide in the dark. So with, I guess, I don't want to make the forecast or the prediction, but I guess this is something which will evolve naturally as that the quality of the sensors, SSA sensors, will evolve.
I would like to emphasize that having a structured way for data sharing has its own power. And data sharing is not in contradiction to making business. It's vice versa. It is a potential to make business. And in system-wide information management, you were able to observe this because in the beginning, big companies, they refused to have a look at it. And smaller companies, they jumped in and were able to make a very good business. Now, the bigger companies, they come in, they identified, and you can share the data, and sharing the data means you can make a service to be paid for. And this, it has, and if you, in the future, if you do not share, you are out of the business. That's
I think in European context, an interesting example for some future considerations should be the Copernicus program and how the evolution of the programs towards the open data policy has evolved to such a case that the program is basically providing free data and giving giving an even ground for everybody to add value to that data and to build a commercial product on this. I'm not sure if this is the way forward in the field of SSA, but it can serve as an inspiration.
Dan?
Just to add to that a couple things. First off is I think that an open data repository is a great target. Again, I think there will be some entities who are not willing to share all their data, but they're willing to have it used. So if we can have a construct where that data is still protected, I think that's a good thing. Another thing is that I think in the long term, maybe 20 years from now, we could have some international group that's doing STM, And, just as was mentioned earlier by Dr. Ruth Stillwell. But I think for now, we shouldn't be waiting. The time is now. We can do some stuff right away. We can look to like-minded countries, organizations, and we can get something going. I think if we wait for a total global consensus, we're inviting disaster, and we don't need to. We can get going.
So Frank, I wanted to ask a question that you sort of alluded to in your last statement. What obstacles have you seen in implementing system-wide information management on the aviation side, and what lessons can we learn from that for space?
Yeah, obstacles. Okay, there were some obstacles, or currently, one big challenge in this whole bunch of information sharing is security. So you have to keep in mind that you must be aware that you have a good security program and methodology, and it is addressed by cybersecurity for SWIM, and you must be always on the state-of-the-art level so that you can really assure that you prove the shared data against all these attacks, especially if you share critical, relevant data that you are really make sure that you are not under attack of some spoofing or something like that someone feeds in a ghost track and tries to deharmonize all these traffic flows and so on. This is an important issue, but it is on a good way. It has an own program there, Cybersecurity for SWIM, and it covers a lot of innovative new ways of handling data from a kind of this Bitcoin comparable issues up until to machine learning algorithms to identify attacks on a new level of guarantee level. And so this is the challenge you have to address, but it is on the way.
And for the rest of the panelists, has spoofing come up a lot in your dialogues about integrating SSA data?
Well, I would like to add one Japanese perspective is that it might be interesting for you because we enacted Space Activities Act last year, and in that requirement, the government included the proof of anti-spoofing system. So they now consider as a part of this permission to space activities that the operators have a spoofing-proof system, which is, I think it's an exceptional.
Yeah. Again, just to say, not to beat a dead horse, SDA, we've been doing this for 10 years. We've had to deal with all manner. We've been living this, not talking about it. We've had to work with, to mitigate denial of service and various other spoofing issues. That's what you learn when you operate things. And any concept who doesn't include it is missing the boat. It's very important.
Dan, I was wondering if you could talk a bit more about, we've had other panelists address this earlier today, but I was wondering if you could talk a bit more about the role of private companies internationally in SSA as we develop international SSA architectures.
Right, and so there's a question of whether, again, as was raised this morning, is there some decentralized construct for STM that could be done? I think that's very legitimate. It could be done. Again, it would have to deal with data, proprietary data, intellectual property, and that I'm not sure how that works. But the chart I showed, and again, the reason I showed it is to say that one very powerful, capable organization that's putting out the space traffic, the SSA data of today, does pretty well, but there's deficiencies. And taken to the nth degree, if you really dive into this stuff, you'll see that we, in order to have a good product here and to have safety of flight, we have to pull data from everybody. We have to have a way to vet it, make sure it's valid, trust but verify, all those things that people usually kick out. In our experience, there are ways to do that by the way you fit your orbits and the way you process your obs and see if they're out of family. And as Moriba's brought up in the past, you need to have disparate data brought in, different sensor types, different organizations, geographically diverse sensors, all that stuff. And right away, you will see when data's bad. It's not that difficult. But I think all that feeds into your question, which is, I think if we can fill the gaps of current processes by bringing in data from a lot of different sensors and groups, different algorithms as well, I think that's the role. And I would see this not as an aftermarket gap filler, but I think even up front for space traffic management, you have to consider how the government and commercial systems can complement and reinforce each other.
Switching gears a bit, for our non-U.S. participants, in the U.S. imposes several requirements related to space sustainability on its own operators, such as you have to file an orbital debris mitigation plan with the FCC. What national requirements like that or others are imposed on operators within your country with regard to space sustainability? Are they like the U.S.? Are there any different ones? I know a lot of countries are talking about insurance for when you're on orbit, things like that.
In Europe, I think for the time being, the situation is, from my perspective, relatively okay if you consider the big players. So either the largest countries on even how safety standards and safety requirements are being handled at ESA level, for example. But I think where the problem arises is with the emergence of these new trends, small launchers, this whole new space community with the small sets. And if these activities will come from those European countries who have not that much advanced in their own regulatory environments, I think this could cause some challenges. So for the time being, I don't think the situation is bad. But if it's not tackled appropriately across the continent, I think there are challenges which may arise.
Similar to the European situation, we look into very closely what the U.S. is doing, because U.S. is the superpower on the space activities, and we are, as Japan, we are always looking to the U.S. policy, where is the U.S. policy is going on, including the International Space Station program. So in regard of the safety issues as well, we're also having a safety community of the space operation safety, which have close communication with the U.S. ones, and they are trying to understand the capability and the implications of those standards and guidelines that U.S. are evolving, and and we also try to keep consistency with our own operations, which means that U.S. regulations are always watched from the other countries.
I would maybe extend this question also to Dan, as he has experience in working in the CCSDC and working with non-U.S. space agencies on space standards. So maybe how do you see their involvement in the development of standards?
It's critical. The international standards efforts, the development efforts are really great. We have in CCSDS, we have representation from everybody here on that effort, and people bring forth concepts for standards that don't exist yet. This paper that we just presented in Australia this week, we talk about standards and some of them that are missing. And if you look at the narrow definition of space traffic management with just safety of flight, physical safety of flight, we've got that fairly well covered. But if you think about the broader context that some propose with RF interference and space weather and sharing of that sort of data, we still have work to be done. but it's a very fruitful, very constructive area. And 20 years ago, I got into space standards. I'll tell you why. We were doing SSA, and we were seeing that one large geo operator, the operator's large and their satellites are large, was conjuncting with another guy, happened to be from Europe. So we reached out, we found the right person, and it was such a close conjunction according to the data that we had. We were not able to affect any change to either operator's satellites because we could not share data. That's when I started into standards. I said, we cannot let this continue. We have to get a standard way to communicate, to understand what we're sharing, and so forth.
And Tomas, you alluded earlier to awareness and capacity building internationally. Since there are so many new entrants in space, from developing countries to high schools, how do we ensure that these new actors adhere to best practices in space sustainability? Like, I've heard a bunch of developing countries say, why do we have to follow best practices in space sustainability? The US and Russia launched so many satellites so long ago, didn't adhere to any best practices. You're going to be putting up hurdles for us to get to space if we have to follow the practices of someone else. How do you get everyone on the same page?
Yeah, I think this is a big challenge to avoid, especially if it comes to sustainability. So you have to assure that there are no pirates on there or some cowboys just shooting satellites like they want and don't care about space debris. So, and there was this good presentation before lunch about trying to motivate with tax credits, so that you are punished if you do not obey, and that you are get profit, or that you get credits if you obey to the rules. But then the rules must be set, and they must be set on international level. And this is more challenging in Europe, because if you compare United States to Europe, you have I think about 21 ACCs in United States, one big country. In Europe, you have about 16 countries and 64 ACCs. So it's hard work to have their harmonization and to set rules. Every person is willing to obey. Yeah.
I think it is homework for those who know that this is an issue, who are aware of the need for responsible behavior in space, to essentially lecture the new entrants in the community which are emerging. I will borrow an idea for one of my colleagues, and he is recently edited a book on cooperation between space engineers and space lawyers. And for example, this is maybe the way forward, promoting the mutual understanding of maybe both sides of a specific program or a specific mission. And I know other institutions have been promoting this capacity building through their own work, being in the work of the ITU, UN, the Secure World Foundation. So there is a diverse array of actors who I think are doing this, and I think the way forward is just to continue.
As a student of international law, this is a question very important of the national implementation of space treaties. And I know that the UN Office of Outer Space Affairs is working very hard on this issue, holding a lot of workshops annually in the different countries, in the different developing countries, in order to outreach why they have to follow the space treaty, what kind of national implementation or national legislation they have to have, and together with the possible responsibility and liability.
The bottom line, I think, still would be to say that from a legal or regulatory perspective, you still, I think, cannot effectively enforce such a behavior on an international level. This is still something which is subject to a national regulatory environment. So maybe that's the way which eventually is, notwithstanding how much we think about promoting responsible behavior in space, essentially the job falls down to the national regulator.
Several of your agencies have worked on active space debris removal techniques or satellite servicing. Without any clear liability by companies for the creation of space debris, what incentives exist for the use of these technologies by private actors, or will governments be responsible for debris removal? How do you envision this will go forward as a policy?
Well, we are developing our active space debris removal program, and I think we will be launched next year, this year or next year, hopefully. And that question is the most difficult question to tackle. We start our experiment by targeting our own object in order to avoid those problems. But in near future, we may have to go to do the ADL to another country's object, which means that we maybe start by bilateral cooperation.
Anyone else on debris removal?
Yeah, maybe one possibility, just an idea, not currently active, but to force this for especially to business-oriented people to maybe to have governments to bring out a credit for people or for countries for companies who really target on that, so that you have a motivation to develop techniques for space debris removal.
I will jump into this with another idea. When we talk about space debris at the conference, which is dealing with space traffic management, I do not think that discussing active debris removal is the number one concern, which is associated with debris. If we agree that there already is something which we can do currently, I think the more imminent concerns are with the debris mitigation, and we can do this through focusing more on the operations aspect, and B, the design aspect of a spacecraft, so it is not contributing to further debris generation. The calculations that I saw were not my own, were saying that if the compliance with the debris mitigation guidelines were much higher than it is currently, then the situation would not increase dramatically in the future.
Good.
One more thing. Darren McKnight, I don't know if any of you are familiar with him, but he's been looking at the massive Russian upper stages that have been floating around. He sent me an email yesterday that two of them had an extremely close approach. I haven't heard of any fragments, so hopefully we're blessed with not a collision there, because that could literally double our trackable population in an instant. So I think active debris removal and his concept of just-in-time debris adjustment or tweaking, if you will, those are valid concepts that are all part of the holistic thing we ought to be looking at. And so AGI is a participant in the CONFERS activity for standardizing, developing standards for rendezvous and proximity operations and satellite servicing. And the goal is to develop those standards, and then I'll help walk those over through the ISO process, for example, so that we can get an international, hopefully get an international consensus on that type of content. But I think it's very important that we, move out. I do worry that somebody needs to fund this, and for the moment, the satellite servicing operators, they have some contracts in place for satellite operators who have satellites where they like to do a life extension. So, there's money there, and hopefully that will fund them, and I think the same technologies they could use to remove debris.
I wanted to give the panelists a chance to ask each other questions, if you have any for each other, before I give the audience an opportunity. Does anyone have any? Okay, I'll go to the audience. Yeah, go ahead, Mark.
First, I wanted to give a few answers to Tomas's thing. What are barriers to data sharing? I can think of three that I hadn't heard. One is you have to have data to share, right? If you don't have the sensors, you don't have anything. We've seen this before. If you do have sensors and they are, let's say, military radars that exist in in Germany and France, then there's a classification problem. So that is a barrier to sharing. Maybe you can share it more easily with the U.S. Air Force, or maybe you can't. That's an internal discussion. And I've seen, for example, SmartNet, which is in Europe, which could have data to share, but they have let's call it a fear of ITAR. I don't think it's founded very well. I think it's an unfounded fear, but still that prohibits them from sharing all their data that they could share, even though they are in a situation where they could share that. And I'm going to turn around now and ask you a question based on one of the remarks that you made in your earlier presentation about somebody in your Brussels meeting that had a statement that you highlighted that he was up in arms. I'm paraphrasing. He was up in arms about the U.S. STM policy, and it felt it was an attack on multilateralism. I'm challenged to understand that, but it echoed with me because several of us in this room have been attacked in writing by the Russian Federation regarding what we're doing in STM. And from my perspective, it's completely multilateral. It starts with Article 6, which is the domestic STM policy, but it operates with other states on a multilateral fashion. So can you help us understand from other perspectives why people would see that when we think that's nuts? So,
why I think this is the case is related to one of the messages which I introduced at the beginning of my speech. Is I do not think we are at the same level of consideration of the issue and the same level of recognition of what is actually constituting the issue and what are maybe the solutions how to approach it. So I think this thing, which we have witnessed in Brussels at the conference, yes, it is the current situation, but I do not think it is the final consideration. And personally, I do not share that view. So I think there is a way in our discussions with other European stakeholders to discuss this a little bit more, to bring in new perspective to such a discussion, such a negotiation, increase the awareness of the whole concept of STM as what other actors, the US, are doing. I think it will change. The current situation is that personally, I feel that what the European approach towards these issues of LTS, of STM has been related to the International Code of Conduct. So, okay, it hasn't, the original issue hasn't worked out, but last year the European External Action Service, so the diplomatic body, the diplomatic arm of the European Union, has reinitiated its efforts, claiming that it's going to lead this idea based on the criticism which was received to the original idea, so much more with the conjunction with the UN frameworks. But I think it's still kind of the same approach, that only doing this stuff multilaterally and not accepting if there are any prior national approaches to this topic. And so I think this is something where we can do better in Europe.
Chris?
Question for Tomas. The burden to an operator of compliance with any sort of space situational awareness, space traffic management, good neighbor policy pales in comparison to the tax savings of licensing your satellites in, as many people do, in, say, Luxembourg, Gibraltar, Isle of Man, what have you. Is there a way to incentivize those tax havens, for lack of a better word? Is there a way to incentivize them to implement some sort of a space sustainability part of their, that goes along with the benefit of lower taxes? Is that something that's ever been considered? And
personally, I do not know, but I do not feel there could be some sort of, as you mentioned it, incentivization from, let's say, from the larger stage, from the European stage, be it the EU level or ESA level. Because the way I think it, and especially this is true for the European Union, and how the legislation and how policies are being adopted there in space officially is one of the shared competencies. So it's not something which Union can impose on its members. It's still something where European countries are having their own privilege in developing what they as well can do. So if such a, and I think it's a good idea, I really haven't thought about this in the past, if such a incentivization is to happen. It can only be a result of a coordination between the countries themselves.
Sure. Okay.
Moriba?
Yeah, I guess this is for anybody on the panel. One of the things that I've heard quite a bit, with regards to space traffic management and this sort of thing is, the 3 S's: safety, stability, security, that sort of stuff. But one of the things that happens in space situational awareness is that in very rare occasions does a single hypothesis explain the evidence. And, to what extent, so basically something happens, different things can explain the same evidence. So it's hard to find the root cause of things that are observed or aren't perfectly observed and that sort of thing. And one of the things that I've wondered is, to what extent are people, A, thinking about that, and then B, the requirements for safety are probably not as stringent as the requirements to get to the single cause to affect relationship, and also people are going to have disputes. That's going to happen. It's just a matter of time before any 2 actors say, hey, I work for Acme Incorporated, and basically, Jimmy over there did something, I think, to me, which resulted in my disruption, and what are you going to do about it? Like, the body of evidence to know that and to be able to say for sure this happened is much, much more than just trying to keep people from colliding with each other. So to what extent can anybody on stage kind of comment about that? Answer me! I'm just joking.
So I'll start. I think there's a lot that can be done to address the majority of what you're bringing up by getting much more involved in predictive things. And this means in many different disciplines, be it RF, where you can do an assessment if you have the full RF data characterization for all satellites. You can predict ahead and say, yeah, we're probably going to get an RF interference tomorrow at noon UTC between these 2 objects. That's not being done today. So rather than do something forensically, here's a prediction that predicts that it may happen, and oh look, there it did. The fragmentation modeling, which I showed you a picture of earlier, that is taking an event which you believe has happened, like Feng Yang, which was what I just finished a paper on, and then looking at where the debris could go, predicting it out, and then flying satellites through that to see, hey, what satellites are put at greatest risk? So then 3 days later, lo and behold, something went out on that satellite. You could say, oh, well, I kind of predicted that. If you look at optical tracking, most systems do not schedule their taking of observations to avoid when you're going to be transiting with another known satellite. And then you end up getting track misassociation, observation misassociation. Well, we knew that. We could have, they're doing this. We could have taken observations when they're furthest apart and try and preclude that. I don't see enough of that, and it takes a lot of data to do, but to me, that's one of the answers.
Yeah, I can agree to that, because if you have more precise data, you can use it to prove that someone generated an accident, but you have also a constructive possibility, so yet that you can, with more precise data, you can show how high the risk is that you will be kicked out by your own debris you maybe generated with a former satellite shot. And then you can convince in the direction of avoiding debris. So it has 2 sides, 2 positive sides for that.
On the opposite side, SIA is a trade association with about 50 different satellite-related companies, owners, operators, launch providers, ground equipment suppliers, and we're consensus-based, and we've been talking about issues like this a lot. I talked to mostly the lawyers, though we have some technical people involved in the discussions too, and this Moriba's questions is something that has come up a lot in our own internal dialogue about how to move forward with SSA and STM recommendations. The lawyers at the companies I work with are very hesitant to propose any sort of binding international agreements because they feel that they are unenforceable for the reasons Moriba pointed out. So it's difficult for industry moving forward, I think, to make recommendations for any binding guidelines on an international front until we figure out how to assign liability definitively, enough so that it would be burden-proof in court. Up in the back.
Ball should be right now. At NASA, we have the luxury of having a much deeper reach back into the JSPOC, CSPOC data set. And what that typically does for us is doesn't create the discovery of new problems, but it allows us to eliminate as problematic conjunction issues that came up and were alerted to us through the normal data sequence. One advocacy avenue that I don't hear pitched very often or pitched in this way for additional data is that, I mean, while conjunction assessment is kind of a funny situation and that more data can actually make the situation worse. It can make conjunctions that didn't seem worrisome seem more worrisome. In the main, it's my suspicion that an increase in data would, by and large, reduce the number of conjunctions or their severity if we had it. I've heard a lot about how more data is a good idea and we really are hoping that somebody will fund it. How about, do you think it would be effective to have a definitive study that would show the amount of ease that owner-operators would be made available to them, how their own difficulties might be lessened if they operated in a more data-rich environment? It seems then that maybe a business case for this, I know in an earlier question I was cynical about business cases moving forward STM, but at least in terms of making a case for broader data, a more immediate relevancy to that could probably be laid out with a certain study effort that would then perhaps convince people that industry investment in additional data rather than merely government investment would bear fruit. Of course, if you don't want to play the STM game at all, you don't want to remediate conjunctions at all, then you don't care whether you have data or not. But if you're at least enough of an educated actor to want to do that, it would seem that it might be in your interest to consider, or at least in a pooled manner, funding initiatives that would make your job much easier from an STM perspective.
Well, I think it depends on who do you ask or who do you put these questions to, because if you ask this, I guess here in the US, okay, I think it's valid even the assessment that you have globally, okay, yes. But again, if I put my European head, what I see currently in Europe is being a considerations of SSA data as a strategic concern. So the only issue is that we want to have more data. And I do not see thinking behind this aspect, what would it cost? Again, this is the argument that I propose here. We are not there yet in Europe, and that's why we cannot, I would say, effectively engage in such a discussion if we do not have that kind of a similar considerations of the issue that you are proposing.
Well, let me follow up with that. Suppose you're Arianespace, flying several satellites, using a lot of propellant, moving out of the way of these conjunctions, about which you have rather little data because you have only the CDM. What if it could be shown that the number of remediations could drop by a factor of 3 or 10 even, if commercial data were purchased? I mean, in a way that extends the lifetime of the satellites. It reduces the size of the crews that have to work the problem. I mean, in principle, anyway, it would seem that there'd be an industrial interest in that kind of work savings.
That's what you could do with a test bed.
Potentially, that's right.
There is a business case for that because having all those false alarm conjunction messages coming out does lead some operators to go to get their own source of data to resolve that, see if it is true or not. So that is a bona fide business model for some SSA services.
So if I could jump in, I would be interested in speaking with you to see what sort of studies you had in mind. But my answer is, at least at a coarse but I think very useful way, we've already done those studies. We've looked at encounter rates in LEO and GEO as a function of missed distance and screening threshold. Collision probability thresholds you can convert into missed distances. And so, we have already figured out what the relationship is. In LEO, it's a squared relationship. So if you can have your accuracy, so make it better by a factor of 2, then you're reducing your conjunctions that your flight dynamics team has to sort through by a factor of 4. It's extremely effective. And the problem is that while, Matt and I actually talked over lunch, while maybe the top management at some of these satellite operators view conjunction risk as kind of a distant thing to them, I can tell you the flight dynamics people don't. And they're trying to wade through, find the needle in the haystack. And the phrase I like is, if you want to find a needle in a haystack, you need to get rid of some hay. And you do that by getting more and more accurate orbits so that when things really are a risk, you're laser focused on those rather than all this other potential stuff.
Yeah, I have a follow-on question for Dan.
Yep.
Given what you just said, do you know of anybody who looks at data collected after and does OD and back propagates to see how meaningful the warning was to begin with? And if so, what are the statistics on that?
Yeah, I can't offer statistics. We have done forensics on that before. And even back in 1998, we did forensics. This was back when ESA, I think it was with NVSat, but they maneuvered their satellite in one direction because of the TLE data they were using. And we later found and were able to demonstrate to them that they maneuvered towards the satellite rather than away. So, yes, we do forensically look at this, and we need to keep in mind in orbit determination, you have your smooth, definitive ephemeris, and then your predicted. And those accuracies are very, very different. But, in a filter, we're always solving the smooth solution and, fitting through unknown maneuvers and so forth. So it's very easy to do those sorts of forensics when you do that.
Yep. Go ahead.
In answer to that question, we do have a customer at Leo Labs who does exactly that. And they look close approach and then interpolate to get the best guess at how close things actually came. Not surprising. Conjunction warnings are pretty good, both ours, the ones we issue, and the ones that C-Spot issues. They agree pretty well. And also not surprisingly, if you were to take both data sets and plot them in the encounter plane, where the projection of the covariance is in the encounter plane, and generally they're not exactly the same because we have our sensors are in different locations than where the U.S. SSN sensors are, so they'll be somewhat different. But more often than not, the actual location, or the best fit location, turns out to be kind of near the intersection of the two. Not surprising.
And just to kind of put this in a different light, the precision charts I showed, the ones for LEO, and then in our paper we have ones for GEO as well. Those are obtained by taking the latest prediction from JSPOC in their SP ephemeris, treating it as truth, which is an assumption, but then differencing that from their previous predictions. And what you're talking about with conjunction assessment and forensics of that is just kind of doing that for two objects rather than one. And so you can see where this overlap, where it's very consistent, and then you can see where it's not.
Last question.
Maybe appropriate. It's sort of a high-level question. It's not a deep STM covariance kind of question. Where I think we are, and where I heard George start us with, is we need to communicate a vision of information sharing that will enable us to all operate safely and efficiently. And we've heard examples from other use cases, the air domain, for example. Pick a domain, pick any use case. Banking, pharmaceutical information sharing. Think of any use case. Where has information sharing been accomplished successfully for that use case? It's a close mirror to what we're talking about now in space. If you were with a congressperson and said, we've done this. We've done it in this domain. We've shared information safely, protected, so on. We can do it in LEO or space. What use case would you cite?
The maritime section is one example for that, where there was an establishment of a very effective data sharing. Everyone can benefit from sharing AIS data, and especially in conjunction with the container load and so on. So this is
that comes to mind immediately as things that move in a domain. You could pick any use case you like. Does anybody have any other use cases that are different than that?
Yeah, so
well, let's start with the guys on the panel.
airline manufacturing company.
Okay. What do you guys think?
Well, again, we're running an association that has been doing the screening for 10 years.
I get
That's,
it, but I'm asking
that's an obvious one.
A very open-ended question.
Yeah.
Because this is an opportunity to say, yes, it can be done.
Well, I can tell you it can be done because we're doing it.
Well, I understand why you say what you're saying. Okay, I'm sorry, I cut you off. Please.
So Boeing and Airbus both manufacture passenger jets. They compete tooth and nail, right? But when it comes to safety, they exchange data on safety factors that have to do with de-icing and other safety factors of transporting passengers. So I think that is a very relevant competition.
Another one. Oh, go ahead, please.
Go ahead. One last comment.
I was just going to say, RF interference mitigation, prosecution of emitters that are interfering with satellite signals. Again, extreme competition between satellite communications operators, but they share data with each other all the time. It's a great model.
So on that note, we have to finish so that we can catch the OneWeb launch. Thank you so much to all of our panelists for your participation.